My 18th birthday is therefore approaching in a few months, and honestly, in what feels like no time at all, things at home have gone from absolutely normal to downright weird. I still find it difficult to understand. I live in a house that belonged to my dad, Chris, not my stepdad, but rather my actual dad, the one who died when I was just 6 years old. That was difficult, certainly, but he made sure I was positioned for the future. He bequeathed the house to me, not to her future husband, but rather to me, when he passed away. Thus, yes, technically I have owned this house since I was a small child. For years, Emma, my mother, and I lived here alone. Things were going smoothly. Our pattern was me going to school, her going to work, and life just happened. Jeff then entered the scene when Mom resumed dating a few years after Dad passed away. Jeff first seemed fine, but I valued his not trying to assume the position of a new dad. Eventually, they tied the knot and moved in with us. Life was not too different. Jeff did his own thing, I did mine, and it turned out nicely enough. Though we were not really close, we got along, and for some time it seemed like everything was somewhat stable. Nonetheless, lately, things now seem strange, like, is this particularly happening? Somewhat strange. Jeff drew me aside just the other day, stating he needed to have a serious conversation. Great, I thought. Most likely about home rules, chores, or some other arbitrary stuff like that, but no, this was something different. He adds, yeah, I know that. Then out of nowhere, he strikes me with this bombshell. After I turn 18, he says, I should start paying rent if I want to stay living here. I simply gaze at him for a moment, trying to determine whether he is kidding. Given their own residence, who asks their child to pay their rent? But Jeff is not kidding here. He is dead real. Right now, I'm perplexed, and to be honest, fairly annoyed. I call this house my house. My dad handed it to me. Not to my mother, and absolutely not to Jeff. I so tell him straightforwardly. Actually, I own the house. When Dad went, he left it to me. And do you know what he does? He chuckles. Indeed, he laughs, like the best joke I have ever told. Dead serious, I am seated there, and he believes I am toying with him. I have to explain it once more, and right now I am growing even more annoyed. I so choose to visit Mom to see whether I am losing my sanity. Mom, did you ever tell Jeff the house is really mine? I question. And get this, she never told him. Never at all. I can't believe it. She has been married to the man for years and never once considered mentioning, oh, by the way, this house belongs to my son. Jeff returns later, and I have to go over it one more. He hardly laughs this time. He at last understands. His wonderful facial expression suggests that he is attempting to digest everything at once. He appears ashamed, which makes sense. I mean, how would you feel if you had been living in a house you believed was your spouse's only to discover it's really her kids? But does Jeff simply walk away from it at that? Not, of course. Starting to defend himself, he says, oh, I only asked you to pay rent because I thought your mom owned the house. Like I haven't already handled my life just fine, he continues. I was trying to teach you responsibility. Indeed, Jeff, asking me to pay rent in my own house is helping me to develop responsibility. From here, I can already sense things becoming more embarrassing. I am, however, not backing down. Breakfast the next morning loaded with conflict. I drop my own small bombshell since I figure now is the moment for my own movement. Keeping my composure, well, since the house is mine, I think it's only fair that you and Mom start paying rent if you want to keep living here after I turn 18. Jeff's face moves from cocky to totally shocked. Actually, his jaw opens wide before he begins to stutter, wait, what? That isn't just. We are family, hence you cannot simply expect us to start paying rent. He is now speaking of family. This man told me I had to pay rent in my own house yesterday, but suddenly it seems unjust when the tables are turned. Look, Jeff, you wanted me to live here and pay rent. That makes it only reasonable if you do as well. You are, after all, living here. He becomes defensive, stating it's different for grown-ups and I shouldn't treat family like that. I simply ignore it. I raise an eyebrow and continue, you seem to have no trouble asking me for rent. Things become hot quickly. Saying I'm just asking them to pay rent to get back at him, Jeff charges me with being vindictive. Before we could even wrap up the conversation, he disappeared. Mom draws me aside later. She had been quiet all through. "I believe you are treating Jeff unfairly," she says. "I couldn't believe he asked you for rent. Nevertheless, if you keep pressing it, this will split the family. Though he began this whole situation, my own mother was on his side. If this family breaks apart, it's because Jeff couldn't manage the truth," I tell her. "My house is this one." She says not much, following that he does not get to create the rules. Now we are all simply living in this uncomfortable stillness. Jeff hardly speaks with me, and Mom seems as though nothing occurred. Everything is different, though. I find myself wondering about the ending for all of this. That whole rent discussion then exploded, and housework became quite embarrassing. A knife would allow you to almost cut the strain. Jeff was not communicating with me, and Emma, my mother, simply floated about the home as nothing had occurred. All of which was different, though. Anytime we were in the same room, it seemed as though nobody knew what to say. I mean, this was a whole new degree of unpleasant, not like I expected things to just go back to normal. Jeff continued to stare at me strangely, as if he were trying to decide what to say, or perhaps he was just enraged. I backed off. He refrained from bringing up the rent issue once more, but you could see the resentment simmering under the surface. I was simply trying to avoid him, head down, hoping things would calm down. Still, one morning something weird happened. I heard my mother on the phone in the kitchen getting breakfast. She was speaking softly since she didn't know I was there, but I listened enough to realize it was about me. I froze, my pulse thumping as I stood there trying to piece together what she meant. She mumbled something like, "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. He's not going to understand. No, Jeff doesn't want to tell him now." They were not sharing with me what. I remained silent, thinking I would catch more, but she must have noticed I was close since she abruptly shifted the conversation and disconnected up. Though I said nothing at the time, her comment stayed with me the rest of the day. What on earth could they be running from? Not as though I had any major secrets waiting to be discovered. The house belonged already to me. What else could there be? By dusk, I could not tolerate it anymore. I had questions and sought responses, so I went to my mother when Jeff was not around. "Mom, who were you chatting to on the phone this morning?" She seemed shocked, as though a deer caught in headlights. She dismissed it, stating it was only a friend and had no significance. Still, I sensed she was lying. I squeezed her and said, "I heard you mention me. What is occurring? Not what are you not sharing?" Her face dropped, and she sighed longingly while seated at the kitchen table, knowing this moment was approaching but not ready for her. She began to explain something, but Jeff entered just as she was ready to reveal whatever secret she had been carrying. Fantastic timing, Jeff. Looking at both of us, he sensed the tension right away. "What is happening on?" His voice was harsh, like he was already on edge, he asked. Clearly not wanting to have this talk in front of him, my mom just shook her head and got up. She stammered, avoiding eye contact with both of us. "We'll talk later." I felt enraged. What was happening, and why were they both behaving as though I cannot handle it? I wanted responses, but naturally that night I was not receiving them. Jeff returned to neglecting me, and my mother pretended nothing had occurred. The next day I realized I couldn't just sit about waiting. I started paying closer since I wanted to find out what they were hiding. I observed them and noted minute aspects of their interactions. That's when I began to see things I had not before observed. Jeff was being peculiar, not only avoiding me but also slinking about, as though he were on a mission. I spotted him paging through some paperwork in my mother's office. I initially thought it was nothing, but then I saw he was looking at house-related records. Why would Jeff suddenly find great significance in the house paperwork? A few days later, then things become even more strange. I watched him meet some hapless man in a coffee shop. Though it sounds severe, I followed him since curiosity won over me. Sitting there, they appeared to be serious and spoke softly. Although I could not hear everything, I caught enough to know something was wrong. Jeff handed the man some papers. He seemed to be signing something. What the devil was Jeff doing? Fed up with the secrets, lies, and all the sneaky behavior, I went home raging. I was done with it. It made no difference whether it was Jeff or my mother. I chose to face both of them that evening. Silent as usual, we were seated around the dinner table when I hurriedly said, "So, Jeff, who was that person you met in the coffee shop today?" His fork stopped midway to his mouth, and he gazed at me as though he had just seen a ghost. "What specifically are you referring to?" she stammered. "You precisely understand what I mean here. I watched you with that man. You handed him some paperwork. What's happening here?" The face of my mother grew pallid. She peered between the two of us, obviously not expecting this bomb to drop exactly at the dinner table. Jeff tried to dismiss it, claiming it was about business affairs. I was not, however, buying it. Fed up, I gave a hard hand on the table. "Jeff, I'm not dumb. This is not only corporate matters. For weeks, you have been acting suspiciously. I know you are hiding something. What the devil is running with?" That's when my mom at last broke. She began to cry, and as she hardly usually does, it threw off me. I was very perplexed when she glanced at me and quietly stated, "Eli, we didn't want to tell you like this, but the house isn't as safe as you think." "What do you mean?" She dabbed at her tears and spoke on. "Your dad left the house to you, yes, but there's something we didn't tell you." The mortgage was still partially owing. It felt like the bottom had dropped out beneath me. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? There is still a lot of debt on the house, and we have been struggling to make the payments. At last. Jeff spoke, obviously uneasy. "We didn't want to bother you, especially with everything scheduled, including your 18th birthday and all. It's difficult. I've been trying to figure out how to manage it without involving you. That hardly started to address my feelings." Everything suddenly made sense. Jeff's strange conduct, my mother's cryptic phone call, their conflict. They hadn't told me any of it. They were trying to work out how to handle this enormous debt hovering over my head. Though my mom tried to explain more, I sat there in startled silence. To be honest, I was no longer listening. All I could consider was how untrue all I knew about my own house and life had been. That evening I slept little at all. I lay there staring at the ceiling, mentally running over everything. About my dad leaving the house to me, well, that was accurate overall. But suddenly I was surrounded with debt, and apparently nobody thought of telling me until it was too late. Jeff and my mother had been having trouble with the payments for some unknown period. Instead of approaching me earlier, they simply let it mount up. By dawn, I could no longer stand it. I had to clear this trash from under cover. Needing exact answers, I sat down with my mother without Jeff around. "All right, Mom, tell me the straight story. We are talking about how much debt? Your people are behind the payments by how far?" She seemed uneasy, as though she wanted not to respond, but I wasn't allowing her off the hook this time. She sighed at last and said, "Eli, it's approximately $80,000. Our payments have been delayed for almost a year." My jaw nearly ground. 80,000? How the devil do you let it get to that stage without acting? Why not let me know? Saying, "I didn't want you to worry." She tried to defend herself, which just infuriated me. At 18, I could manage it. Rather, they had waited until the debt spiraled out of control, bombarding me without notice with an $80,000 bomb. Then, still another idea struck me. Something even worse. Wait, was Jeff attempting solo fixes for this? That explains why he has been prowling about. She simply nodded, and I sensed she understood things had gone out of hand. Though I was enraged, I felt guilty for her. With a $80,000 debt, all I could do was sit there, staring at her, understanding that piece by piece everything I had counted on was fading. That overall shock of learning about the $80,000 debt made me feel as though I was flying backwards. Just days before, I felt my future under control. My dad had left this house, I would soon be turning 18, and everything seemed steady. Suddenly, I was confronted with the terrible reality of a debt that would utterly ruin my life. Even worse? It was not only Jeff acting suspiciously. Half-truths and lies formed the basis of what I understood about my own house and security. That evening, sleep was not feasible. For hours I lie awake, mentally reviewing everything. How did Mom and Jeff let it to get this bad? How could they withhold something this big from me? And so, knowing this, what was my claimed use for it? Knowing I was entering adulthood with this much financial baggage weighing me, The weight of the circumstances made me sick. By morning, I could not handle it anymore. I wanted solutions as well as some organization of this mess. I pressed her once more when I discovered my mother alone herself in the kitchen. "Mom, I have to know exactly what we are working with here. We are how far behind on payments?" She turned aside, regret evident on her face. "Eli, it's not just the $80,000, she said, nearly in a whisper. "I'm not sure how to tell you this, but there is more." My stomach fell as she clarified that the bills have been stacking up. We had been trying to keep up, but the debt is far worse than we realized. They had not even seen how the interest had snowballed. They had been so preoccupied with maintaining the house. Here I was, a young person barely out of high school, facing down a debt mountain not even of my own creation. I had another disturbing notion as I tried to make sense of this new world. Jeff had been acting weirdly, meeting people, and surreptitiously prowling around. Later that day, when he was out in the garage, I thought it was time to approach him once something told me he was already working on his own solution. I moved straight up to him without delay. "Jeff, I need to know what you're planning, but I know about the debt. I watched you meeting with the man and turning over documentation. About the house, what specifically are you doing?" Looking shocked, he stammered over his words before at last confessing what he had been doing. "Eli, I have been trying to straighten us out of this problem. I was shocked since I was researching refinancing the house or a second mortgage to help with debt." "A second mortgage? Are you truly serious? You are simply going to load additional debt on what we already have." "Jeff, that's simply digging us deeper. That is not mending anything." Saying it was the only way to keep the house, he sought to defend himself, but I was not buying it. His supposed strategy was only meant to drive us more into the debt black hole. I let out a wrath. I went away, seeking time to clear my head. Trying to sort everything, I pulled on a jacket and left the house, meandering the neighborhood. The more I considered it, the more enraged I became. Perhaps we might have avoided this before it got so terrible if they had been up front with me from the beginning. Now, here I was, caught in a $130,000 hole with no apparent escape route. I continued to stroll, and a concept gradually developed. Though it was dangerous, it was the first hope I had seen since this dream started. Suppose I leased the house instead of selling it. Should I be able to attract tenants, the rental income could be sufficient to cover the mortgage payments and progressively pay down the debt. I would still be the owner of the house, but I would not be drowning in payments. Though it was a long shot, it was the only alternative that would not have me losing the final thing my dad left behind. That evening, I was eager. I stayed late investigating all I could discover on property rentals. There were so many stages involved, and I had no idea where to begin. I would have to figure out the rental prices in my area, make sure the house was in good condition, locate decent renters, and handle all the documentation. It was plenty, and would not be simple. Still, maintaining the house paid off. This was my dad's house, and I was not ready to lose it without struggle. I presented the notion to my mother early the next morning. "What if we let someone rent the house? We may locate a less expensive location to live, pay the mortgage with the rent, and gradually reduce the debt. That means we keep the house and I won't have to sell the remaining bit of my dad's legacy." She seemed startled, but to my delight, she didn't close it. "Eli, that's a big responsibility," she added with doubtful voice. "Landing a lease is not easy. Are you quite sure about this?" Though I was unsure, it seemed like the best chance I had. I told her I would rather try this than wind up paying debt off for the next 15 years. She stopped long enough to glance about the house, and I could tell she found it difficult. This house had many memories, not just mine but also hers. But a little later she nodded. "Okay, allow us to try this. But Eli, we have to exercise caution. This is not going to be simple with her on board." I started running. I spent the next week getting the house ready, correcting things I had never even noticed before, and rendering it as attractive as could be. Jeff, in the meantime, was not enthusiastic about the overall scheme. He continued to be sarcastic, saying things like, "Oh, so you're actually trusting strangers to live here? Good fortune for you as a landlord, Eli." I ignored him. "Hope you are ready for all the headaches. I chose this, and I wasn't going to let him destroy it for me. Not sure anyone would even be interested, I posted the house online. Still, a few days later I began receiving messages. Actually, many wanted to visit the house. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was going to work. The showings presented an unusual experience. While some seemed like they would have taken wonderful care of the space, others, not so much. One man arrived late, appearing to have not showered in a week, and simply walked about as though he owned the house. Indeed, a no on that one is absolutely clear. But then Sarah and Luke, a young couple, entered the picture. Late in their 20s, recently married, they were searching for a house to begin their lives together. They looked really delighted about the house, asked all the proper questions, and were polite. I felt good about them when they departed. A few days later, I offered them the spot. Happy and ready to move in at the end of the month where they were. At last, it felt as though things were falling together. Perhaps, for once, things were going to turn around. Naturally, though, nothing can ever be so straightforward. I got a call from the bank about 1 week before Sarah and Luke were scheduled to move in. My tummy fell as I saw the second number. Gary, the mortgage-related advisor we visited, was it? He sounded austere. Eli, I'm worried there's something we should talk about after looking over the documentation for your property, he stated. Great. Exactly when I felt I had everything under control. He dropped the big bombshell when I descended to the bank to see him. The house supposedly had a lien. Years ago, just after my dad passed away, my mother borrowed money against the house. She had never advised me. I had no notion. The worst thing about it is, on top of the $80,000 mortgage debt we already owing, the lien obligation amounted to around $50,000. I thought I had been gutly punched. Another $50,000. Not knowing even how to handle it. Already drowning, it felt as though we were sinking much further. That evening, essentially numb, I went home and faced my mother. Why not let me know about the lien? We might have handled this earlier. We are far more in debt now, and I have no idea how we are meant to get out. She seemed crushed, hardly able to look back at me. I'm so sorry, Eli, she said. I felt I could manage it. I didn't want to lose the house and thought if I simply kept things under control, you wouldn't have to know. Then everything spun, and I felt for her even while I was enraged. She perhaps was even more overwhelmed than I was. That did not, however, alter the facts of our circumstances. Now we were looking down a $130,000 debt, and renting the house would not be sufficient to pay for it. I thought I was drowning for several days. I kept thinking about my dad, about how hard he had worked to provide me this place, and now it felt like it was sliding through my hands. But I was not ready to give up. Though I knew one thing, I wasn't letting go of the last link I had to my dad without a struggle. I had no idea how we were going to remedy this. I felt like I was drowning after learning about the extra $50,000 lien on the house, bringing our overall debt up to a devastating $130,000. I traveled aimlessly for days, immersed in contemplation, attempting to organize everything. Now it felt like it was sliding out of reach. My dad had given this house to me, a little of himself he wanted for me. Though the debt was crushing and I had few choices, I couldn't stand to think of losing it. Then one night I woke up looking at the ceiling and had an idea. I questioned whether renting the house may still be profitable, but with a twist. What if I retained it as a rental property long-term, rather than returning home following rent out? Perhaps, just possibly, I could save enough every month to meet the bills. Though it would be a risk, no question, it was the one strategy that gave me the impression of not being entirely helpless. I sat down with my mother next morning and laid it all out for her. Mom, we cannot keep living here with this much debt, even though I do not want to sell the house. Imagine renting it and discovering somewhere smaller. I would take care of the renting aspect. The rental money would cover the mortgage. She stared at me with a mixture of concern and surprise, but after a lengthy silence, she nodded. It might simply provide us an opportunity to get back on our feet. I think it's worth a try if you're ready to take that on, Eli. Still, it is a great deal of responsibility. Are you absolutely sure? I nodded. But deep down, I wasn't sure exactly. On maintaining this house, though, I had never been more certain. My dad had worked too hard to provide me with this place. If renting it out would help to preserve it, then I would do whatever it took. I had found Sarah and Luke, the young couple I had shown the house to earlier, renters within a week. Moving in delighted them, and everything looked like it might really work out. But Jeff had to become involved just as everything was starting to fall into line. He continued to make disparaging comments about the entire strategy, such, "So we're simply going to live off rental revenue now?" I turned away Eli. "Hope you know what you're getting yourself into." I passed the point of let Jeff's negativity affect me. Though this was my house and I was going to see it through, I could tell he hated not being in charge. Things were beginning to seem somewhat more under control around 1 month after Sarah and Luke moved home. For the first time in a long time, my mother and I discovered a little, reasonably priced apartment close by and felt tranquil. The rent would provide consistent revenue to assist pay the mortgage. If all goes according, I might simply make it through this whole nightmare without having to sell the house. Naturally, though, things never stay easy for very long. A few months after moving out, the bank called once more. This time, our mortgage advisor, Gary, told me our monthly payments will rise as the mortgage's interest rate was rising. My tummy fell. I had computed everything using the original payment figure. We would be short every month with the new rate, and I was not sure how I would pay for the difference. Resolved not to give up hope, I returned to investigating choices, searching forums for hours on everything from debt consolidation to refinancing. I read, but nothing seemed to match. I came upon an idea that really felt feasible just when I felt all my efforts were useless. I could house a roommate in the little flat I shared with my mother. Even with the higher mortgage rate, the additional income would help cover the variations in our expenses. When I told my mother, she hesitated and fretted about letting a stranger share our apartment. Still, she consented at last, following plenty of debate. After listing the spare room, a few weeks later we came across a young man called Jake, who appeared respectable enough. He often kept to himself, worked long hours, and was quiet. Things felt steady at last since his rent helped us meet the shortfall. Everything worked nicely for a while. I maintained the house, oversaw the renters, and made sure we could pay our monthly bills. Still, it was really draining. Managing money, keeping up with repairs, and keeping on top of everything else seemed like working a second job. Though I was under stress, I reminded myself each time I felt like giving up why I was doing this. I was not going to let this place go without a struggle. My dad had left me here. Months went by and we began to gently reduce the debt. Though still a lengthy path, we were headed forward. With Jake's rent helping out, I could really breathe a little better since the rental income was covering most of the mortgage. All things I never would have been handling at 18. I learned how to handle maintenance, deal with tenants, and manage a budget. Though under pressure, I felt good about what I was doing since I grew up quickly. Jeff ceased offering his typical sarcastic remarks at last. He probably understood that I knew what I was doing and that I was not some naive young person. Perhaps he simply lacked something to say. In any case, I paid no attention. I was following my strategy since I had one. Then Mom glanced over at me with a reflective face one evening as we were seated at the dinner table. "Eli, I just wanted you to know, your dad would be really proud of you. Though I understand this is difficult, you are accomplishing something amazing. Hearing that made everything worthwhile. Thank you for battling to save this beautiful house. If it meant preserving my dad's legacy, all the tension, the restless nights, and the ceaseless research, I would do it all again." Things began to steady over time. Though the debt did not vanish overnight, we were on a road, and every payment seemed like a little triumph. Though there would be obstacles along the road, and I still had a long way to go, for the first time I felt like I had control. The house was still mine, and like my dad would have wanted, I knew I would fight to keep it whatever came next. And life at home changed accordingly as well. Not exactly what I had in mind, not flawless, but something I could be happy with. Through the battle, I discovered that family was about discovering strength in oneself to defend what counts, not only about living under one roof. And for me, that was the house Dad left behind. This house was my dad's love, his diligence, and his belief in me all together in one place. Not just walls and a roof. I was not letting it go either. Not now, nor ever.